begin with our first presenter, Anderson Phillips.
Good morning. My name is Anderson Phillips, and today I'll be presenting The Cult of Charisma, when charisma replaces character and leadership. Prominent 19th century theologian, author, and Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon writes on the ruination of character, saying, "Character is always lost when a high ideal is sacrificed on the altar of conformity and popularity. While it is widely accepted that character and moral depth should remain central in leadership, especially in large-scale leadership, it can be observed that modern leadership has undergone a notable shift in values, where the esteemed virtues of integrity, humility, courage, and self-awareness once stood, now lie charm, emotional appeal, and media presence. In other words, modern leadership has dismissed and distorted character, ushering in the contemporary virtue of charisma. Although charismatic leadership is a captivating, persuasive, and powerful form of leadership, it is rooted in emotional manipulation and the suppression of reason. All leaders must appeal to the emotions and desires of their followers, especially as the scope of world leadership expands. However, the extent to which charisma has replaced character in leadership is unprecedented and has blinded many to the deceptive and unstable nature of charismatic leaders. The power and danger of charisma lie in the ability to persuade individuals, hinder independent thinking, and drive rapid change. These attributes of charisma make charismatic leaders more prone to becoming self-serving and abusive of their power. Charisma alone is not corrosive to an organization. However, when the stable and deliberative character is absent in leadership, followers and organizations will suffer. Undoubtedly, character-driven leadership is, as Charles Spurgeon writes, being sacrificed on the altar of conformity and popularity. While detrimental charismatic leadership is on the rise in the modern age, Paradise Lost by 17th century author John Milton demonstrates that charisma has roots in original sin. Satan lost the war and was cast down forever from heaven. The fallen angel awakens in a strange place, lying with the other fallen in a lake of fire, devoid of light, and in a constant state of physical pain. Stripped of his heavenly glory, he gazes upon his unfortunate comrades. Knowing he led a multitude of angels who were serving their Creator in the perfection of heaven to an eternity of suffering, apart from God in hell. Satan hoists himself from the lake of fire and begins to assemble his troops. He internally recognizes his hopeless state, and understanding that heaven is lost and God's authority is inescapable, he sets his sights on appealing to the demon's emotions, vices, and irrationality. He realizes the only power that remains is his power to persuade. Charisma takes root in the void where character ought to reside. Confident in his dishonesty, Satan speaks of their defeat as temporary, validates the demon's anger, and unites the demons to continue the fight against the powers of heaven. The demon's new plan hinges on corrupting God's precious creation, man. While innocent and curious Eve is unprotected in the garden, Satan appears to her, disguised as a serpent. Appealing to Eve's human nature, he flatters her, suggests that God is wrongfully holding something from her, and shrewdly instills doubt of God's commands. Eve chooses to listen to the deceiver and sin. The serpent painted Eve's choice to sin, something she would have never done in her right mind, as both rational and wise. The enemy did not make Eve sin with force. Rather, he speaks and she listens. The danger of this serpent was not in his teeth, but in his tongue. As Solomon writes in Proverbs 18:21, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit." The word character derives from the Greek word charakter, meaning engraved mark or imprint on the soul. By way of metaphor, Hellenistic Greek shifted its meaning to signify a defining quality or an individual feature. In the modern age, the word character is more often used to signify a figure from a story. However, it still maintains its meaning as a distinctive quality, now encompassing also the concept of moral nature. Someone with good character is an exemplar of traits such as humility, integrity, courage, self-awareness, determination, empathy, and optimism. Based on Aristotle's conversations on virtue ethics, modern philosophers have defined good character as having steady and permanent disposition to do what is good and refrain from doing what is wrong, having morally desirable wishes, desires, purposes, and goals, and having the tendency to respond emotionally toward things in the morally appropriate way. Charisma, a word also derived from Greek, originally meant divine gift. Today, charisma is used to describe someone with personal charm. However, Webster defines charisma as a personal magic of leadership, arousing a special popular loyalty or enthusiasm for a public figure, such as a political leader. While both charisma and character are prevalent descriptors in today's discussion of leadership, charisma is not the opposite of character. Rather, it is the mechanism by which character reaches people. Leadership, in its most ideal state, must strike a balance, a parallel between the two virtues of charisma and character. One Halloween night in Abilene, Kansas, a young boy pleads with his parents to let him go trick-or-treating with his older brothers. His parents refuse, saying he is too young. The boy is overwhelmed with rage and runs from his house kicking and screaming and begins pounding his fist on the trunk of an apple tree. With bloodied fist, he returns home, and his father lashes him and sends him to bed. While he is still crying, his mother enters his room. Instead of continuing to punish him, she instead bandages his wounds and quotes Proverbs 16:32, saying, "He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city." The young boy was President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who cited this story from his childhood as a formative experience that made him who he was as a leader, both militarily and politically. Eisenhower was raised in a small town in the prairies of Kansas, frequenting a Methodist church and taking after his father's quiet work ethic when completing chores for his family. Growing up in this environment instilled self-restraint and a strong moral philosophy. Eisenhower, as a leader, was characterized as someone with great charm and a magnetic personality. Fellow military leaders described him, saying, "His real strength lies in the human qualities. He has the power of drawing the hearts of men toward him the way a magnet attracts a bit of metal. He merely has to smile at you, and you trust him at once." Coupled with this captivating personality, however, was a set of disciplined habits, a settled disposition to do good. This moral code is exemplified most in moments when charisma cannot manage. For example, when Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, paced through the halls preceding D-Day with 2 notes in his pocket, one for victory and one for defeat, accepting full responsibility in the case of a loss. Eisenhower governed with the temperance instilled in him by his upbringing and led his country with dignity and moral responsibility. Character-driven leadership is the most universally accepted ideal model of leadership. However, just as history teaches of the imbalance of the scales of justice, it also teaches of the constant shifting of morals and values in society. Imbalanced leadership favoring charisma over character has been proven to lead to tyranny and the collapse of churches, organizations, and governments. Renowned authors and thinkers, such as Yale professor and political commentator David Brooks, Harvard graduate and U.S. government consultant Daniel Shareau, and 19th century pioneer of crowd theory Gustave Le Bon, have written on the unstable power of unchecked charismatic leadership. In the early 1700s, France was drowning in debt following the War of Spanish Succession. The country's economy was desperate for stimulation and salvation from its depression. John Law, a young financier from Scotland, claimed he had a system by which he could restore France to its prior prosperity. Law was a particularly compelling man, well-groomed with a quick wit and audacious confidence. Despite Law's checkered past as a convicted murderer and a serial gambler, his charm and charisma allowed him to forge a connection with powerful figures in France, enabling him to enact his plan. Law proposed that France replace its gold and silver coinage with paper currency, backed by the bank he founded. These banknotes appear to be a tremendous success, both stimulating the economy and reducing national debt. Fueled by the success of this first financial plan, Law and his supporters turned their sights westward to the new and abundant land of North America. Law pledged riches and boundless prosperity to all who invest in his company, the Mississippi Company. People trusted Law. He was known as a successful economist and had a cognitively disarming allure. His company, however, pledged riches that did not exist. The company's illusion fell, and investors, many of whom had sold estates, property, and family heirlooms in order to invest, were left destitute. People lost faith in Law's banknotes, and France ended up in an even worse economic state than it had begun. Law's charisma is what propelled him to power, while people ignored his character, resulting in the near collapse of a nation. The research conducted by David Brooks in writing The Road to Character lays a foundation for the ideal, character-driven leader, as well as warns of the dangers of narcissism, pride, and charisma in modern leadership. Charismatic leaders, especially those with narcissistic tendencies, abuse their power by taking advantage of symbolic status. Researcher Daniel Sankowski defines symbolic status as a psychological phenomenon, the tendency for followers to tacitly regard leaders as parental figures. While the authoritative bond between a parent and a child is undoubtedly strong, this type of bond belongs only to families. If a leader is able to harness the power of symbolic status, they are likely to abuse and persuade followers to comply with unreasonable requests. This claim has been historically exhibited by both political leaders and, unfortunately, church leaders as well. Influential modern-day apologist Ravi Zacharias was posthumously exposed for sexually assaulting more than 20 women in various capacities over the course of his ministry. Zacharias was a profound speaker and an exceptionally amiable man. Victims of Zacharias pointed to his abuse of symbolic status, calling his demeanor toward them fatherly. Zacharias' status as a pastor placed him above reproach in the minds of his followers. What began as innocent paternal trust was twisted by Zacharias and used for exploitation. This is evidence that charismatic leaders prove to be powerful and driven at first, but that drive quickly becomes self-serving and leads to the abuse of power. In cases of poor leadership, character is the missing component, especially when charisma is in overabundance. If a leader relies solely on charisma, the much-needed strong and lasting foundation is lacking, which can lead to the collapse of organizations. Charisma creates a following, while character establishes a foundation. Charisma is a powerful tool in leadership, as it can disarm followers' ability to reason, allow quick persuasion, and drive large amounts of change in an organization. Since charisma has been proven to lead to the abuse of power and manipulation, why do people put such faith in charismatic leaders? The answer lies in the first point listed above: the disarming of followers' ability to reason. Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech is a display of rhetorical charisma. King persuaded the masses and drove major change in America. His charisma, however, is authentic. It is rooted in something greater than himself. Authentic charisma can be rooted in religious beliefs, a moral cause, or service to followers. Contrarily, President Donald Trump's Save America speech preceding the riots of January 6, 2021, is a recent display of narcissistic charisma used to evoke loyalty to himself, hinder his followers' ability to reason, and rapidly call a crowd to action. Both leaders use repetitive phrases in their speeches. King repeating, "I have a dream, let freedom ring, and now is the time." And Trump repeating, "Stop the steal, fight like hell, and we will never give up, we will never concede." King called for radical unity in the people of America, while Trump's speech incited disunity and separation from the other side. Trump called his followers, quote, "the true patriots and the real people of America," while referring to the opposing political party as, quote, traitors. Trump instilled a crisis mindset in his followers, further prompting change, saying that the left wants to, quote, steal the election and that we must, quote, save our democracy. Trump's crisis rhetoric and display of narcissistic charisma undoubtedly escalated tensions and was arguably the catalyst for violence, vandalism, and death, while the authentic charisma of King prompted civil justice and unity. Trump's speech, only 70 years after King's, shows how unbalanced modern political rhetoric has become, how the scale has shifted from logical authenticity driving change to emotional indoctrination driving change. How has American leadership become this perilous? The power of charisma to drive change, hinder independent thinking, and persuade individuals is why charismatic narcissism is so dangerous. When a group of people is in a time of need, it is significantly more vulnerable to the persuasion of a charismatic leader. This is largely because charismatic leaders rely heavily on emotional pull, compelling rhetoric, and the ability to control or hypnotize a crowd. Charismatic leaders step into a crisis and promise salvation, often painting themselves as the only way to salvation. For example, 1920s Germany was suffering greatly from the aftermath of World War I. Economic depression, hyperinflation, and mass unemployment. This clear crisis morphed into the most notable display of narcissistic charisma throughout all of history: Hitler's rise to power and rule over Germany. Hitler came to power and defined a common enemy as the source of the nation's crisis. Similar narratives to this have allowed for the rise of many modern political tyrants, such as Fidel Castro, Benito Mussolini, and Saddam Hussein. Additionally, perceived crises can be just as powerful as real ones. Charismatic leaders can manufacture crises, feeding into followers' fears, fueling a crisis mentality, and amplifying their own power by way of the vulnerable state of their followers. Society must be more wary of charismatic leaders, as they're becoming more powerful, prevalent, and dangerous in the modern world. It is often assumed that having a leader who is predominantly driven by character is not profitable in this world. Leaders must be cutthroat, quick, and concerned chiefly with practical success. Can great practical success and moral depth coexist? It is often preached that you must be extraordinarily competitive, cut corners, and promote yourself in order to be successful as the leader of an organization. An unwritten proverb of modern capitalist societies is that virtue doesn't pay the bills. Diane Belcher, author for Harvard Business Impact, argues that the previous assertion is not true, that character and practical success can and often do coexist. In her article, The Case for Leadership Character, Belcher writes, "Research shows that organizations with leaders who achieve high character scores have an average return on assets 5 times higher than those with low character scores. Leaders in the study were graded on traits such as humility, integrity, courage, self-awareness, optimism, determination, and empathy. The results of the study conclude that hiring and fostering charismatic leaders is not only morally wise, but also economically advantageous." Harvard business professor Max H. Bazerman argues that the impact of one character-driven leader in a senior role of an organization is exponential. He writes, "Leaders can do far more than make their own behavior more ethical. Because they are responsible for the decisions of others as well as their own, they can dramatically multiply the amount of good they do by encouraging others to be better. As a leader, think about how you can influence your colleagues with the norms you set and the decision-making environment you create." These objections shed light on existing tensions in modern leadership. Organizations often do reward charismatic and ostentatious leaders. The efficiency and rapid growth perceived as the result of a charismatic leader seem undeniable. However, prevailing evidence suggests that these objections do not undermine the importance of character in leadership. Research shows that in the long term, character, although perhaps slower and less exciting, provides universally advantageous stability. Additionally, moral character is not only specific to one religion or worldview. One does not need to be religious in order to be selfless, courageous, and honest. Modern philosopher Jeffrey Morgan asserts, quite clearly, there are millions of people who live moral lives without the assurance of a moral order in the universe brought about by religion. As charisma fluctuates with societal preferences, character endures for centuries. Still, charisma itself is a tool in moderation, a tool that can change the world for good if properly wielded alongside character. For these reasons, character continues to triumph as the chief virtue of leadership. Continually amplified by the growth of social media and the public's constant hunger for novelty, charismatic leadership is becoming increasingly prevalent in society. Organizations continue to prioritize popularity over principle, which will result in the breakdown of social and political structures. Character has remained as the cornerstone of lasting leadership for centuries. It is the only foundation of leadership universally proven to benefit organizations. Powerful charm must be complemented with depth. Leaders must choose character. The burden, however, lies equally, perhaps more so, on followers. Moral literacy and the ability to recognize charismatic deception are imperative skills for modern voters to possess. Critical thinking and discernment act as guardrails against abuse. Thomas Jefferson insists upon this, saying, "An educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as free people. Although harm may not be immediate, blindly following world leaders is a moral and ethical risk. Charisma has won when followers believe they are immune to deception. Followers have the power and the responsibility to stop abuse before it takes root." Additionally, King Solomon writes in Proverbs 31:30, "Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting." While charisma fades and charm wanes, character will remain strong. Thank you.
I'll get started. Oh, I'm sorry. I cut
I would
you
now
off.
like to open the floor for questions from the judges.
Sorry, that's the second time I've done that. You very effectively showed some examples of people who lead with charisma who may be lacking character. You gave Trump as an example. Can you give me any examples, even if they're people I've never heard of, who you think are effective leaders who are not particularly charismatic?
So yeah, absolutely. I think that without charisma, character-driven leadership can exist. However, it has to be on a smaller scale. Whenever, in the absence of charisma, a leader won't make it to the top of a government or the top of an organization. So that's why you don't hear about that type of leader very often. But whenever I was researching this paper, I would think about people like our old head of high school, Mr. Kendrick. I would think of him. He was such a character-driven leader. You would walk up to him and he would genuinely ask you, like, "How are you? How are you really?" and it hit your heart and you felt it. And I think that he was...
He asked me recently.
Really? Yeah. Exactly.
And I replaced the guy, so.
I know, absolutely. And I just think of leaders like that I've seen in our school on a much smaller scale that I see such great character, and not always the most charismatic, the most ostentatious or flashy leaders, but they have such character in every step they take.
Thank you.
You're taking too long. Anderson, well, first of all, I'm so proud of you. You did such a good job.
Thank you.
You are someone who exhibits both. You have great charisma, but you also have great character. So keep that character in check.
Thank you.
I keep thinking about a lot of things. You know, it's one thing to hear you all practice your senior thesis and when they're all kind of discombobulated, but when we hear them like we have 10 every day straight in a row, I go home and I think about it, and I can't help but think how many of these go together. I'm listening to you, and it makes me think about Andrew talking about how we lack virtue, and then I'm thinking about Charlie. How does intuition and reasoning play into this? In literature class, I would always teach you all that when you can look back historically, you can look at the leaders to see what the ideals of that society were. So when we look at these leaders, what does that say about us as a society? And do you think we want somebody to lead us with character, or do we want charisma? And how, I don't know, how can you tie all that into these other things? Do you think intuition and reasoning plays a part in how we select leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was going to bed last night, I was actually thinking about that. It was around 1 a.m. I woke up and I'm thinking, man, my thesis really ties into so many other people.
It
So I was
does.
thinking about Charlie's and I was thinking about Andrew's. But I think that the emotions that Charlie talked about that are really what's ruling you is so prevalent in this thesis, because you see these charismatic leaders who can harness your emotions like a weapon, and they can pretty much dictate what a whole crowd does very effectively, especially a crowd, because crowds, as we have seen, are less logical than the average individual. And so I think that while charisma, to answer your second question, while a charismatic leader is what we want, like as we have seen in it makes me think of the Old Testament whenever we see the Israelites are begging, we want a king, but God's like, that's not what you need. We are begging right now for a charismatic leader. Society as a whole is. We want something that's going to stimulate our minds, stimulate our attention, and grasp us onto our screens. But what we need is a charismatic leader. There's a difference between what we want and what we need.
Thank you.
Anderson, I wrote this down. First of all, like the first page of your paper, you talk about this idea of charisma being a contemporary, because you even used the contemporary version of virtue of charisma, like it's a modern issue. You use lots of historical examples. Why is it a contemporary problem that we're dealing with? Why is it a modern problem and not just something that's always happened?
Okay, so absolutely, that's a great question. It is something that's always happened, and that's why I use those historical examples. But what I wanted to portray through this paper is that the scale has increased, the amount of people who are being affected by charismatic leaders has increased, the speed has increased, the rate at which they can affect us, and the consistency has increased. The amount of time that we're spending under the influence of a charismatic leader. I wanted to emphasize that, especially in my last paragraph, whenever I talk about amplified by the growth of social media and the public's constant hunger for novelty. Since since attention has become a commodity through social media and through just the attention economy that we live in, charisma has only grown. But it's seen all throughout history, but now it's an ever-prevalent issue, is what I believe.
So I guess another thing that makes me think of, and you and I have talked about this some, if we had to have a character detector, like, we could bring out our character detectors to figure out, I mean, a lot of times we're seeing people, it's one thing to see somebody on the news every day. It's another thing to see them in short snippets, maybe on social media or somewhere else, or have just very limited exposure to someone. How are we as people, how are we to detect character? So it's one thing to cut through the charisma and to think about, if I'm evaluating someone, how do I know if they have character? What's my character detector that I'm going to use to know if someone has character?
That's a good question. So I think that the way that you can, I talk about moral literacy and the ability to recognize charismatic deception. The second part's a little vague, I would say, the ability to recognize charismatic deception. But they really tie in together. Moral literacy, being educated, being well-read, those are all things that contribute to being able to recognize a leader who's driven by character and a leader who is driven solely by charisma. And as Christians, we have the ultimate character-driven leader, Jesus. And so we get to look and we get to say, it's like, what would Jesus do? How you say that with yourself, but you're like, what would Jesus do? Like, would Jesus, obviously he wouldn't do certain things that, just because we're in a modern age and Jesus was in, but what would Jesus do? You think about that and you think, is this leader leading like Jesus would? I think that's how I try to think about it.
That's good. You're asking a lot of the populace to be morally literate and well-read. So
Absolutely.
That's a high standard, Anderson. I appreciate that. I think you're right.
It's a good expectation.
That's a good expectation.
That's why we're doing classical education. One last question. You said on a very large scale, very large companies or an election in the U.S., charismatics tend to be the only ones that rise to the top. People who don't have charisma presumably don't have the endurance and stamina to get all the way up there fast enough. So should we just be fatalistic that we're just going to have narcissists only to vote for forever?
Well, absolutely not, because
Also, you can run in 17 years.
yeah, I'm majoring in music, but but so okay, so that's why I use the example of Dwight Eisenhower, who was such a charismatic leader. Like his military, his other leaders around him described him saying, his real strength lies in the human qualities. He can draw the hearts of men toward him the way a magnet attracts a bit of metal. But then coupled with that, you see him leading a military to victory in one of the biggest war in the entire world. I think that's why I use the example of Eisenhower, and I think that type of character-driven leader is not gone. It's not obsolete in this world. That can push through today as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there's no further questions, thank you.